Dictatorships fall for a lot of reasons, but one of the most common reasons is when the numbers simply don't work out for them any longer, when it becomes untenable. We saw that at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and guess what? We're seeing it again repeat today. This is what we're seeing in Vladimir Putin's Russia. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for Kiev Post, and I'm a political scientist who studies Putin's Russia. So let's take a look at what's going on inside of Russia right now. Keep in mind, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the history of the world. However, it does appear that Russia has been able to survive so far. At least that's what we see from the outside. It is true that Russia is afloat, but it doesn't mean it's going to stay that way for much longer. And there's a few reasons why Russia has been able to keep afloat for so long. And it's exactly the same reason as to why Vladimir Putin is not taking peace negotiations with Ukraine seriously. So one, the West has effectively been helping Putin. How is that? Well, one, we chose to not cut off his entire banking system from the SWIFT system and the international monetary system. Secondly, we have chosen to not enforce our own sanctions. Countries continue to buy Russian oil, and we don't go all out and sanction them or put high tariffs on their goods. Why is that? Calculated decision. We decided we don't want problems with India and with China. Thirdly, we know that Russia is openly violating sanctions with its ghost fleets. And again, calculated decision, we do nothing to slow it down or stop it. Not the Americans, not the Europeans. These are calculated decisions by us. So, if we were to get serious about this, we'd have to look at how it is we could put pressure externally on Russia. But internally in Russia, there's another interesting attribute of this that has allowed Russia's economy to continue going forward. And that's because Putin has invested about 50% of the nation's budget into defense. That's creating a sugar high. He's putting tons and tons of money into defense, which allows jobs to be created and for it to have the appearance of growth. And that's exactly why Vladimir Putin does an entire song and dance about wanting negotiations, about wanting to end the war, but he's not serious. And he's bluffing. He's in fact just lying to us, and we let him get away with it. Now, he counts on his internal mechanism that keeping the war going keeps his economy going, so he's an internal motivation to not end the war. But next to that, there is the outside part that we are choosing not to play with. How can we put pressure economically from the outside? Because ultimately, there's only one thing that Vladimir Putin cares about, and it is the only reason that he'll take negotiations seriously. And that's if his regime's survivability is threatened. So at this point, Putin is undoubtedly skating on thin ice, and the cracks are forming. Time is not on his side. Everything is set, and if we choose to push just a little bit harder, he will crack through the ice. Let's take a look at some of those numbers, just to illustrate this point. Oil, not metaphorically, quite literally, is the foundation of the economy of Russia. It's about 1/3 of the Kremlin's entire budget. But in 2025, that foundation started to show some cracks. Ural's crude oil, Russia's main export blend, has fallen to about $50 per barrel. That's 30% below what the Kremlin had built its entire national budget on, which is around 70% a barrel. So what does that mean realistically? It means that Russian government is suddenly short of cash. It's very short on cash. It needs lots of it and has no means to get it easily. The Russian finance ministry has slashed its oil and gas revenues and its forecast for next year. In fact, it went from $115 billion down to just $88 billion. That's a shortfall of $28 billion. It's a lot of money. And it's money the Kremlin was counting on. Not just for the war, which obviously needs lots of money for that, half the national budget, but it needs some money to pay the pensions, to cover the salaries of the police, to cover the salaries of the soldiers, to pay for the bureaucracy, and to keep the Putin regime running. Keep in mind, that is the social contract that Russia has. Yes, you have a dictatorship, you have no liberty, you have no freedom, but we create stability for you. If Putin does not create stability, then who needs him? What does he provide? But now they must begin to start cutting expenditures. This is not going to play out well for Putin. And just think historically, what happens when a regime built on fear and fear starts to all of a sudden cut the salaries? And what happens if they start paying the soldiers on time, or stop shipping food to the soldiers, or stop arming the soldiers, or stop subsidizing the food for the people in the provinces, or stop paying for the propaganda that everything's going well? Well, when that artificial system, this one that has created the illusion of normalcy, begins to get cut, cracks form. And they become very evident. They become very clear. And you'll be able to see them with your own eyes in the near term if we allow them to form. But there's actually a bigger problem for Vladimir Putin, which is the good part. And it's not just about the prices. It's that 80% of Russia's oil is being purchased by two countries, China and India. 45% and about 35%. That's it. They are Putin's economic lifelines. Without them, Putin has nothing else. But those lifelines on which he's pulling now, they're starting to fray. We see them coming apart in his hands. And why is that? Look back in April, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican in the United States Senate, in a bipartisan bill with Democrats, came out with secondary sanctions on countries that choose to buy Russian oil. But on any country that buys oil as well above the G7 price cap, which we set when the war began, anyone who buys it above that will also get sanctioned. And that changes everything. It means the market is already reacting, and we've seen that. Just the past 3 months, India's cut Russian oil imports by 20%, and they've at the same time started buying more oil from Africa and from the Gulf. China's largest state refineries, Sinopec and PetroChina, have also begun. Very quietly, they didn't make a big deal about it, started to pause their long-term contracts with Russian suppliers. But why? Why would they choose to do that? Very simply, because they know the risk. And access to the Western markets and financial systems matter far more to them than just cheap Russian oil. Once again, had we enforced our sanctions from the very beginning, more than 3 years ago, all of this would have already taken place. But Vladimir Putin was counting on the West being too scared of striking up tensions or creating problems with China or with India. So now, finally, Putin's lifeline is fraying and his options are sinking. So what can he do next? Some might ask, well, does he have a ton of money in his sovereign wealth fund? Well, in fact, he does. Let's discuss that. The National Wealth Fund, which is the Kremlin's emergency savings account, the rainy day fund, before the full-scale invasion had about $113 billion of money. Today, it's down to about $39 billion. So 65% drop just in the course of 3 years. That's a lot of money being lost. The incredible part, only about 15 to 18 billion of that is actually liquid. I mean, that is that it can be used by the government today if it wished to use it. At current spending levels, that money will be burnt through within the next 12 months. Vladimir Putin is running short on cash. Now, that means Putin can't afford to lose more buyers. It also means he can't afford to lose more revenue. And he definitely can't afford, if both these things are true, to continue doing this war indefinitely. And you know when we saw this before in history? When we saw countries spending tons and tons of money for defense or for military purposes that it couldn't afford, and essentially it bankrupt the country and collapsed it? The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did something very similar. In fact, in the Soviet Union, if we look back, in the 1980s, oil was about $115 a barrel. It dropped down to $30 a barrel. The USSR lost half of its hard currency earnings, and it couldn't import the grain any longer, which it so desperately needed, from the outside. So without the ability to service its debts, it could no longer maintain the illusion of power. And the Putin regime is built on this illusion, this myth of power. Without it, it's a very difficult position. But looking back, between 1985 and 1991, the Soviet economy shrank by 20%. Just imagine a fifth disappeared. And by 1991, the Kremlin couldn't even pay for the printer ink necessary to print more money. So, is history repeating again? It would appear so. Now, today's Russia is obviously much smaller than the USSR. It's more isolated, and it's even more dependent on oil than the USSR was in many ways. And so, Putin is able to get around a lot of the problems that he is having with the oil. And one of those ways is via his shadow fleet. So they have about 600 aging ships sailing around false flags, fake flags, and shell companies that are used to establish them. And they move Russian oil around the world. They do it to violate the price caps. They do it violating environmental rules. But in all cases, they do it to keep Russia's economy afloat. But the secret that we've chosen not to exploit? These ships can be stopped. All of them can be stopped. In fact, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Law of Sea says in Article 110 that you have the right to board and inspect vessels suspected of illegal activities, including the evasion of sanctions. So the United States and the European Union, if they had the political will, could easily start seizing these tankers today. They could easily board them, and the entire Russian smuggling system would definitely collapse. Not even a question about it. Overnight, Russia's ability to access more currency due to the legal trade of oil would disappear if we wished to do so. Unfortunately, thus far there has not been a political decision to do so. But even when we look at the price cap on oil, it's $60 per barrel. Now, energy analysts agree that if the cap were lowered down to $30 per barrel, half what the current cap is, then Russia's revenues would drop by another 40%. Now, imagine how that would devastate the Kremlin. It would be a total disaster for it. Once again, why don't we do this? It's a political decision. It's not an economic decision. We can afford to do it. We can enforce it. It's just if we wish to. What that would result would be, or what result we could expect from that action, is that it would lead to an immediate cut in the military procurement. It would delay payments to the soldiers. It would spiral the ruble. And if you think the ruble is solid, it's not. The official inflation rate is about 10%. The reality is that it's closer in the 20s, mid-20s, high 20s. And that's evidenced by the Russian central bank's key interest rate, which they've bumped up to 21%, something that would not happen if the inflation rate was only 10%. The economic pressure could very well fuel unrest within the country. And in the regions that are already struggling to survive, it could create a total disaster. This is where we are right now. We have these doors open to us if we wish to pursue them, but it's a political decision. Meanwhile, within Ukraine itself, Ukraine is striking deep inside Russian territory. It's had new incursions into the Kursk Oblast. Russia is also having problems producing more artillery. It has a huge military, true, but it can no longer secure even its own borders if Ukraine is coming back and forth and taking new territory inside of Russia. Keep in mind, Ukraine is a country that's only a fraction the size of Russia. And Ukraine is occupying Russian territory. It's truly amazing. I mean, Ukraine at the same time is accelerating the domestic production of weapons in a way that is phenomenal. It is accelerating its production of drones and new technologies for drones in ways that Russia is simply not able to do. Now, Russia does invest half of its economy or national budget into the war and to defense. Well, the Western countries combined, NATO countries, are obviously investing much more into their militaries than Russia is. So Russia's ability to actually create a conflict with the West is unrealistic because it can't afford to. So why don't we try to force Russia to outspend itself? Why don't we force Russia further into debt? Why don't we do more so that the Russian military-industrial complex becomes more and more expensive by encouraging inflation in Russia, something we could do externally if we chose to? Ukraine has allies. They're helping in different ways, whether it's Europe or the United States. But once again, Russia's allies are few and far between. China, its top ally, is definitely hedging its bets. There is no way that China is going to link its entire future to Russia, a country that's got an economy smaller than Italy's. In fact, when you look abroad at the other allies that Russia has economically, Venezuela, North Korea, they're total basket cases of economies. Russia has no ability to count on them or to be able to hope that they will bail them out at some point in the future. So Putin's really not negotiating from a position of strength. He's bluffing. But he's bluffing effectively. He's bluffing in a way that the West takes what he says seriously. So every time he talks about peace talks, he has been bluffed so far. He's not been serious. And every time he's talked about the need for compromise, it's really just a bid to buy time. But the time has changed since 2014 when the war first began. And the world has changed. The world has woken up to the fact that Vladimir Putin is skating on thin ice. And the fact that Vladimir Putin has lied to us continuously, he's treated us like fools, and he does. He plays us like fools because we choose not to stand up to him. The fact is this, is that his reserves are almost gone. The buyers are backing off. The oil isn't enough. And history is breathing down his neck. The Soviet Union, about 30 years ago, ended because of very similar conditions. The United States and Ukraine are not weak. In fact, they're in these negotiations from a much stronger economically, politically, militarily, and moral position than are the Russians. So if we hold the line and we are able to continue to allow Ukraine to win, to give Ukraine more weapons so it could truly beat the Russians back, and the Russians are then forced to invest more of their economy into their military-industrial complex, which will create higher inflation, print more money to pay for that, which worsens inflation even worse, and enforce the sanctions, we could truly destabilize Russia. And the Soviet Union collapsed because of oil. and the economics associated with it, not because it lost a war. This time we can see both happen simultaneously. And it's not some sort of a far-fetched theory because, in fact, the numbers don't lie. Putin can't escape forever. The ice is cracking. It is starting to thaw. And it's only a matter of time before it breaks. The only question at this point is, do we have the moral courage to stand up to Putin, the bully, once for all? Will we take the steps needed to actually debase the regime's economy? We can, if we wish to. If we truly wish to have peace, we have to do something different. We can't do exactly the same as we've done every time so far and expect a different outcome. That's insanity. To repeat the exact same things expecting a different outcome. This time we must do something different. We must push to truly debase the Russian economy and force it to come to the end. We truly can bring Russia to its knees if we wish to. It's our choice. We can do it today if we wish. Please like and subscribe below. And thank you for joining, and thank you for supporting Ukraine.